They tell us that growing older means losing things: strength, speed, certainty. They say that after 60, life slowly narrows, as if the world gently closes its doors one by one. But that's not quite true, at least not in the way most people think. What often slips away with age is not life itself, but the noise around it, the constant pressure to become someone else, the exhausting need to prove that we still matter, the quiet fear of falling behind an invisible clock that was never ours to begin with. For a long time, we believed that holding on is the same as staying alive. We grip tightly to opinions, expectations, old wounds, old roles. We tell ourselves that if we loosen our hands, something precious will fall and shatter. Yet somewhere along the way, maybe sitting alone in the early morning light, or watching a familiar street grow quieter, a different understanding begins to surface. It's subtle, almost shy. You realize that some of the weight you've been carrying was never meant to be permanent. That much of what you fought to protect no longer needs your defense. That life, strangely enough, feels lighter not when you add more, but when you finally stop clutching what no longer breathes. This realization doesn't arrive with fireworks. It comes softly, like a truth you've always known, but didn't yet have the courage to hear. So that's how it really is. Getting older is not about becoming less. It's about becoming less crowded by expectations that never fit, less crowded by voices that were never kind, less crowded by a version of yourself that was built to survive, not to rest. After 60, something begins to loosen naturally, not because you failed to hold on, but because your soul finally understands what is no longer necessary, and that understanding changes everything. For most of our lives, we are taught to chase happiness as if it were something ahead of us, a milestone, a reward waiting patiently at the end of effort, sacrifice, and endurance. We're told that if we hold on long enough to work, to family roles, to expectations, to being useful in the way the world defines usefulness, peace will eventually arrive. That one day, if we've done enough, life will finally soften. But age quietly reveals something different. Happiness was never hiding in the future, and it was never something we were meant to grip tightly. It was always closer to a sense of release than a sense of achievement. What people often misunderstand about aging is this: they think it's a process of losing joy, when in truth, it's a process of shedding illusions. When we are younger, holding on feels like strength. We hold on to plans. We hold on to identities. We hold on to relationships even when they slowly drain us, because letting go feels like failure. But holding on and living are not the same thing. Holding on is tense. It asks us to stay alert, guarded, braced for loss. Letting go, on the other hand, is not giving up. It is finally trusting life enough to stop wrestling with it. With time, a gentle shift happens. You begin to sense that not everything deserves the same weight anymore, that some worries repeat themselves, not because they matter, but because they are familiar. That much of what once felt urgent was never truly essential. This isn't wisdom delivered as a lesson. It's recognition earned through years of quiet endurance, disappointment, love, and survival. And perhaps the deepest truth of all is this: inner freedom does not come from controlling life more carefully. It comes from loosening your grip on what life has already outgrown. After 60, letting go stops feeling like loss. It begins to feel like honesty. And from that honesty, a new kind of peace slowly takes shape. One that doesn't demand effort, only awareness. What follows are not rules and not instructions, but gentle realizations that tend to surface on their own when life has been lived long enough. Letting go of the need to be understood by everyone. There is a quiet exhaustion that comes from spending a lifetime trying to explain yourself, explaining why you made certain choices, why you stayed, why you left, why you became who you became. For many years, being understood feels essential, as if our story only becomes real when someone else nods in agreement. So, we repeat ourselves, gently at first, then with frustration, then with silence when words no longer work. You see it in small, familiar moments, a family gathering where an old version of you still lives in other people's eyes, a conversation where you realize the listener has already decided who you are before you finish your sentence, a well-meaning question that carries an invisible judgment, and for a long time, you try anyway. You soften your truth, you rearrange your words. You hope that this time, if you explain it just right, something will finally click. But somewhere after 60, something loosens. You begin to notice how much energy was spent chasing agreement that was never coming. How many explanations were offered to people who were never truly listening. How often you mistook being understood for being valued. The shift is gentle, but unmistakable. You realize that your life does not require a jury, that your choices have already been lived, and therefore already justified. Understanding, you learn, is a gift, not a debt you owe the world. And with that realization, a surprising calm appears. You stop defending, you stop correcting, you stop shrinking or stretching yourself to fit into someone else's limited frame. In the quiet that follows, something beautiful happens. You feel lighter, more at home in your own skin, at peace with the truth that those meant to truly see you already do, and those who don't never needed convincing. Inner peace grows not when everyone understands you, but when you finally understand that you don't need them to. Letting go of old regrets that no longer teach anything. There are memories that return not because they matter, but because they are familiar. They arrive quietly, often at night, or in moments when the world slows down. A decision made years ago, a word spoken too sharply, a chance not taken, or taken too late. For a long time, regret feels like responsibility, as if replaying the past might somehow correct it, as if self-blame were a form of loyalty to who we once were. You recognize the pattern easily, standing in a familiar place and suddenly remembering how different things might have been. Hearing a song that pulls an old life back into the room. Wondering, not for the first time, who you might have become if one moment had unfolded differently. In younger years, regret can still teach. It sharpens awareness, it shapes judgment, it whispers lessons that help us choose more wisely next time. But there comes a point, often after 60, when regret stops being a teacher and becomes a habit. You begin to see that some lessons were already learned long ago, that certain memories return only to reopen wounds that have already done their work, that punishing yourself again and again does not honor the past. It traps you inside it. This realization doesn't erase responsibility. It deepens compassion. You start to look back with softer eyes. You remember how limited your knowledge was at the time, how heavy fear can be when you don't yet know how strong you are, how survival sometimes disguises itself as mistakes. And slowly, regret loosens its grip. Not because the past changes, but because you finally allow the past to be complete. Peace enters when memory no longer demands payment, when you can say quietly and honestly, I did the best I could with what I knew then. What remains is not bitterness, but tenderness, a respect for the person you were, and gratitude for the one you became by surviving it. Letting go of relationships that exist only in memory. Some relationships don't end with conflict. They end with silence, no final argument, no dramatic goodbye, just a gradual absence that settles in so quietly you almost don't notice when it becomes permanent. For a long time, you keep a door open in your mind. You imagine conversations that never happen. You carry a version of someone who no longer exists, or perhaps never existed in the way you hoped. It shows up in small human ways. You think of calling, then stop. You rehearse what you would say if you met again. You hold space for a reconnection that life keeps gently declining. In earlier years, this holding on feels loyal, noble even, as if remembering someone is a way of keeping them alive. But with time, something becomes clear. Not every bond is meant to last a lifetime. Some relationships belong to a season, a shared need, a particular version of ourselves. They are real, but they are not permanent. After 60, the heart grows tired of carrying ghosts. You begin to notice how certain memories drain you instead of warming you, how revisiting some connections brings longing rather than peace, how waiting for people to return keeps you partially absent from the life still here. Letting go, in this sense, does not mean erasing love. It means allowing love to rest where it belongs, in the past. The shift is subtle but profound. You stop checking the door. You stop rewriting old conversations. You allow silence to be what it is, instead of what you wish it to become. And in that acceptance, space opens. Space for relationships that meet you where you are now. Space for presence instead of memory. Space for peace that does not depend on someone else's return. Inner freedom arrives when you stop asking yesterday to show up today and start honoring what is already standing in front of you. Letting go of the pressure to always be strong. Strength is a role many of us learned early. To endure without complaint, to carry weight quietly, to become reliable, steady, unbreakable, especially when others depended on us. For decades, this kind of strength feels necessary. It keeps families together. It pays bills. It moves life forward when stopping doesn't feel like an option. You see it in familiar moments, saying, "I'm fine," when you're not. Minimizing your own pain because someone else's seems louder. Believing that rest must be earned and softness must be justified. Over time, strength becomes habit, and habit becomes identity. But after 60, something shifts in the body and the heart. You begin to feel how heavy constant strength has been, how much emotion was postponed, how many tears were swallowed because there was no space for them at the time. The realization is quiet, but freeing. Being strong was necessary, but it was never meant to be permanent. You start allowing moments of honesty, admitting fatigue without apology, letting vulnerability surface without turning it into a failure. This is not weakness, it is maturity. True strength, you discover, does not come from holding everything together. It comes from knowing when you no longer have to. As the pressure to perform resilience fades, something softer enters. You listen to your body instead of pushing it. You speak your needs without explaining them away. You accept help without feeling diminished. And in that softness, peace deepens. Because inner calm does not grow in constant tension. It grows in spaces where you are allowed to be human, tired, honest, unfinished, and still worthy of rest. Worse, letting go of the fear of being left behind. There is a quiet anxiety that follows many people through life, the fear of falling behind new ideas, behind younger voices, behind a world that seems to move faster each year. For a long time, this fear keeps you alert. You try to keep up with conversations that no longer feel natural. You learn tools you don't truly need. You measure your relevance by how well you can still keep pace. It shows up in subtle ways. A hesitation before speaking, wondering if your thoughts still matter. A sense of being slightly out of step with the present moment. The unspoken question, is there still a place for me here? In earlier years, staying current feels like survival. It keeps doors open. It protects dignity. It reassures you that you haven't disappeared. But after 60, another truth emerges. Life is not a race you can lose by slowing down. You begin to notice that your value was never tied to speed. That wisdom does not arrive quickly. It settles slowly. That depth cannot compete with noise, and doesn't need to. The fear of being left behind softens when you realize this. The world moves forward, but meaning moves inward. You stop chasing relevance and start inhabiting presence. You speak when something is true, not when it is timely. You listen more. You choose depth over display. And in that choice, a different belonging appears. You no longer need to stand at the front. You no longer need to be current to be real. You simply need to be here, awake, aware, and fully yourself. Peace arrives when you stop asking life to wait for you, and instead, allow yourself to walk at the pace of your own soul. When you step back and look at what has slowly fallen away, a pattern begins to appear. Not loss, but clarity. What remains after all this letting go is not emptiness. It is space. Space where tension once lived. Space where noise used to echo. Life, you begin to realize, becomes simpler, not because it offers fewer moments, but because fewer moments demand explanation, defense, or endurance. There is a calm that settles in when you are no longer carrying what life has already released. When you stop revisiting doors that have closed gently but firmly. When you trust that what stayed has done so for a reason. Peace does not come from adding better habits, sharper thinking, or stronger willpower. It comes from subtracting wisely, from recognizing which burdens were never yours to keep forever. After 60, meaning rearranges itself. You no longer measure a day by how much was accomplished, but by how honestly it was lived. Silence becomes nourishing instead of lonely. Slowness becomes depth instead of delay. All the small realizations begin to weave together. You don't need to be understood by everyone. You don't need to punish yourself for paths already walked. You don't need to carry relationships that no longer breathe. You don't need to perform strength or chase relevance. What remains is something quieter but stronger than all of it. A sense of being aligned with life rather than braced against it. A feeling that nothing essential is missing, even if much has been left behind. This is not the peace of arrival. It is the peace of release. A steady, grounded awareness that says, I am no longer crowded inside myself. And in that uncluttered space, life does something unexpected. It meets you gently. At some point, life stops asking you to become more and begins inviting you to listen more closely. Not to the world outside, but to the quiet truths that rise when everything unnecessary has settled. You may notice it in small pauses, moments when you no longer rush to fill the silence, when you sit with a memory without needing to judge it, when you feel no urge to explain your life to anyone, not even to yourself. And perhaps the most surprising part is this: nothing feels missing. What if this phase of life is not about holding on to what once defined you, but about discovering who you are when those definitions loosen? What if peace is not something you reach, but something that appears when you stop reaching altogether? You might begin to wonder which thoughts still deserve your attention, and which ones have simply been repeating out of habit. Which relationships still bring warmth, and which ones linger only because they always have. There is no need to answer these questions quickly, or at all. They are not tasks to complete, but invitations to sit with yourself more honestly than before. As the years stretch behind you and the path ahead grows quieter, you may find that the most meaningful moments are no longer the loud ones. They are the gentle realizations that arrive without effort, a sense of ease in your own company. A soft gratitude for what was without longing to relive it. A calm acceptance of what is without needing it to be different. So perhaps the real question is not what else there is to do, but what you are finally free to release. And when you sit with that question, unhurried, unguarded, what begins to fall away on its own? What remains? And how does it feel to simply let it be?